Sometimes the person hired to play the role of a wife becomes the only woman who can truly change a man's heart. The city of New York glittered beneath the late evening sky, thousands of golden lights stretching across Manhattan like a sea of restless stars. But inside the towering glass headquarters of Hayes Global Holdings, the atmosphere felt far colder than the winter air outside. On the top floor, in an office framed by floor-to-ceiling windows and polished black marble, Alexander Hayes stood perfectly still behind his massive walnut desk. At 36 years old, he had built one of the most powerful technology empires in the United States, a company worth billions and expanding across 3 continents. Yet in this moment the young billionaire looked less like a conqueror and more like a man cornered by circumstances he could not control. The long conference table before him was filled with board members in dark suits, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of tablet screens and the reflection of Manhattan's skyline behind them. Silence hovered in the room until the company's senior legal advisor cleared his throat and spoke carefully. "Mr. Hayes, according to the final clause in your father's trust, the position of CEO must remain in the hands of a family man who represents stability for shareholders." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained calm and controlled. "I represent stability." The lawyer nodded politely but continued. "Your father defined stability differently. The document states the CEO must be married and demonstrate long-term personal commitment to family leadership." Around the table, several board members shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew the late Richard Hayes had been a traditional man who believed power should be anchored by family. What none of them expected was that his final condition would suddenly threaten the leadership of his own son. Outside the window, the Hudson River reflected the moonlight like silver glass, but Alexander barely noticed. His thoughts were moving quickly, calculating possibilities the way he had done since the day he built his first company at 23. Marriage. The word felt foreign, almost inconvenient. Alexander Hayes had never built his life around romance. His schedule was measured in quarterly earnings reports, international flights, and meetings that stretched from sunrise to midnight. Relationships had always been brief, polite, and distant. Yet now, a single line written years ago by his father threatened to remove him from the company he had spent his entire adult life building. "How long do I have?" Alexander asked quietly. The legal advisor checked the document. 6 weeks before the board must review compliance with the trust. 6 weeks. Around the table, murmurs passed through the directors like a quiet storm. Alexander didn't react. Instead, he turned toward the enormous window and watched the lights of Midtown blinking in the distance. The city never slept, and neither did ambition. Somewhere below, taxis moved through the streets like streams of yellow fire. Somewhere across the river, millions of people were living ordinary lives far removed from the cold calculations of billion-dollar companies. For a moment, Alexander wondered if one of those lives was about to collide with his own. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the calm precision that had made him famous in the business world. "Then we solve the problem." One of the board members leaned forward. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Alexander turned back toward the room, his gray eyes sharp and unreadable. "A marriage." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, curious, cautious, almost intrigued. "A real one?" someone asked. Alexander allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile, the kind that usually appeared right before Hayes Global closed a billion-dollar deal. "A practical one." Outside, a cold wind moved between the skyscrapers of Manhattan, whispering through the night, as if the city itself understood that something unusual had just begun. Because somewhere in Brooklyn, a young woman named Maya Johnson was finishing a late shift at a small accounting office, unaware that within days her quiet life would cross paths with the most powerful man she had never heard of, and that a contract written for business might become the beginning of a story neither of them could predict. The next morning the city woke beneath a pale winter sun that turned the glass towers of Manhattan into mirrors of light. But in a modest brick building in Brooklyn the day began much more quietly. Maya Johnson pushed open the door of Harper & Blake Accounting Services at exactly 7:45 in the morning, the small brass bell above the door chiming softly as she stepped inside, with a folder tucked under her arm and a cup of coffee warming her hands. The office was simple, nothing like the towering headquarters of the companies whose finances sometimes crossed her desk, But Maya had always believed dignity had little to do with marble floors or skyline views. She switched on the overhead lights, revealing rows of organized desks and the familiar scent of fresh paper and brewed coffee. For most of the city, the workday had not even begun, but Maya preferred arriving early when the world was still calm. It was easier to focus when the phones were silent and the streets outside had not yet filled with impatient traffic. She hung her dark wool coat on the rack near her desk and sat down. Opening the folder that contained the final numbers for a nonprofit hospital project she had been reviewing the night before. Maya Johnson was 28 years old, careful with details, steady with numbers, and known among her co-workers as the kind of person who fixed problems quietly without expecting praise. Her long dark curls were tied neatly behind her shoulders, and the soft gray sweater she wore matched the calm determination in her brown eyes. She worked not for recognition, but for responsibility. 2 miles away in a small apartment where her younger brother was still recovering from surgery, hospital bills were stacked in careful envelopes on the kitchen counter. Every spreadsheet she balanced, every late hour she worked, carried the same quiet purpose. Across the East River, however, another morning was unfolding very differently. In the penthouse office overlooking Central Park, Alexander Hayes stood beside the window again, the early sunlight reflecting across the polished floor of his private workspace. His assistant entered with a digital tablet and a careful expression. "The legal team prepared the preliminary structure you requested," she said gently. Alexander took the tablet and read the document quickly. The language was precise, written with the kind of cold efficiency used in corporate acquisitions. A 1-year contractual marriage agreement. Financial compensation clearly outlined. Mutual privacy terms. Public appearances required for corporate stability. No emotional obligations. The arrangement looked less like a wedding and more like a merger between 2 separate lives. He placed the tablet down on the desk and considered the city beyond the glass. Somewhere in that endless grid of neighborhoods lived the person who would become part of this agreement, at least on paper. He did not need romance. He needed someone intelligent, discreet, and independent enough to understand the boundaries of the arrangement. "Begin background screening," Alexander said calmly. "Candidates with strong professional records and no connections to the corporate media world." His assistant nodded. "There is one profile the analysts flagged this morning." She tapped the tablet again, and a photo appeared on the screen. A young woman standing beside a stack of financial reports, her expression calm and thoughtful. Maya Johnson. Alexander studied the image briefly, unaware that at that exact moment the woman in the photograph was reviewing hospital expense statements at her small desk in Brooklyn. The city moved between them like a living machine, millions of lives intersecting every hour without ever noticing. Yet sometimes fate did not ask permission before changing everything. Sometimes it simply moved 2 strangers closer together, one quiet step at a time. 3 days later, the winter air over Manhattan carried the quiet tension of something about to change. Inside the modest Brooklyn accounting office, the afternoon sun filtered through narrow windows and painted long golden lines across the desks while Maya Johnson reviewed the final page of a hospital budget report. Numbers had always made sense to her. They followed rules, remained honest, and never pretended to be something they were not. Life, however, rarely behaved with the same clarity. The sound of the office phone interrupted her concentration. Maya reached for the receiver calmly. "Harper and Blake Accounting Services. This is Maya Johnson speaking." A professional voice answered from the other side of the line. "Miss Johnson, my name is Daniel Whitmore. I represent Hayes Global Holdings. We would like to invite you to a private financial consultation tomorrow morning." Maya frowned slightly as she glanced at the clock on the wall. Hayes Global was one of the largest companies in the country, a corporation that operated in a completely different financial universe from the small nonprofit organizations she usually helped. "I believe there must be some mistake," she replied politely. "Our firm does not typically work with corporations of that size." Daniel's tone remained courteous but firm. "There is no mistake, Miss Johnson. Mr. Alexander Hayes specifically requested your presence after reviewing your financial analysis work on several hospital foundation reports." Maya felt a moment of quiet surprise. She had never met Alexander Hayes, though she certainly knew the name. Every business magazine in America seemed to feature his face beside headlines about billion-dollar technology expansions, and international investments. May I ask what this consultation involves? She said carefully. Mr. Hayes prefers to discuss the matter in person, Daniel answered. Transportation will be arranged for you tomorrow at 9:30 in the morning if you accept the invitation. Maya thanked him politely and ended the call, then sat back in her chair while the quiet office hummed with the low sound of computers and distant traffic outside. For several seconds, she simply stared at the phone, wondering why one of the most powerful businessmen in the country would ask to meet a junior accountant from Brooklyn. The explanation did not arrive. Instead, curiosity settled gently beside caution. Across the river in Midtown Manhattan, Alexander Hayes stood near the conference window of his private office while the city moved beneath him like a restless ocean of yellow taxis and flashing signals. Daniel Whitmore had just finished explaining the call. She seemed surprised, Daniel said. But she accepted the meeting. Alexander nodded slowly. He had spent the last 2 nights reviewing the candidate profiles suggested by his legal team. Most of them looked perfect on paper, yet felt completely wrong. Too ambitious. Too eager to step into the spotlight. Too comfortable with the idea of being associated with wealth and attention. Maya Johnson was different. Her records showed quiet professionalism, consistent financial discipline, and almost no public presence at all. A woman who did not appear interested in fame. That alone made her unusual. Tomorrow morning, then, Alexander said calmly. His voice carried the same composed certainty he used during corporate negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet this situation felt strangely unfamiliar. For the first time in his life, he was about to propose something that had nothing to do with stock prices or global contracts. Outside the window, the evening sky deepened slowly toward dusk as lights flickered across the towers of Midtown. 2 people in the same city were moving toward the same moment without realizing how profoundly it would reshape their lives. One believed she was attending a financial meeting. The other knew he was about to offer the most unusual agreement he had ever written. The following morning arrived with the pale clarity of early winter sunlight stretching across the towers of Manhattan. A black sedan moved quietly through the streets of Brooklyn before crossing the East River. Its polished surface reflecting the steel bridges and rows of brick buildings that slowly gave way to the shining skyline ahead. Inside the car, Maya Johnson sat upright with her hands folded gently in her lap, watching the city transform outside the window. She had almost declined the invitation the night before. Something about it felt unusual, even improbable. Yet curiosity and responsibility had convinced her to come. When a corporation as powerful as Hayes Global requested a meeting, ignoring it did not feel wise. The car finally turned onto Fifth Avenue where the glass headquarters of Hayes Global rose above the surrounding buildings like a monument to modern ambition. The structure was almost entirely transparent, sunlight sliding across its reflective walls, while people in tailored suits moved through the lobby with quiet urgency. Maya stepped out of the sedan and paused for a brief moment before walking toward the entrance. The marble lobby inside felt vast and bright, with polished floors and tall ceilings that carried every echo of footsteps. A receptionist greeted her with professional warmth and guided her toward a private elevator reserved for executive meetings. As the elevator rose smoothly toward the upper floors, Maya studied her reflection in the mirrored wall. She wore a navy blue blazer and a simple cream blouse, clothing chosen not to impress, but to remain professional and calm. She had attended many financial meetings before, yet none had taken place in a building like this. On the top floor, the elevator doors opened to a quiet hallway lined with glass walls and soft gray carpet. At the far end stood Daniel Whitmore, who welcomed her with a courteous nod before leading her into a large office overlooking Central Park. The view was breathtaking, the wide stretch of green framed by the tall buildings of Manhattan like a living painting beneath the winter sky. Standing near the window with his back to the room was Alexander Hayes. He turned slowly when they entered, his tall frame outlined by the sunlight behind him. Maya recognized him instantly from the business magazines she had occasionally seen in waiting rooms. In person he appeared even more composed, his dark suit perfectly tailored and his expression calm, yet thoughtful. For a moment neither of them spoke. Alexander studied the woman standing before him. Maya Johnson looked exactly as her profile had suggested, steady, intelligent, and quietly confident without any sign of ambition for attention. There was a dignity in the way she stood that immediately separated her from the candidates his advisors had previously suggested. Finally, he gestured toward the chairs near the conference table. Maya sat down, folding her hands gently as she waited for the explanation that had brought her across the city. Alexander remained standing for a moment longer, considering how to begin. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts with far less hesitation than he felt now. At last, he spoke with the same calm tone he used during corporate negotiations. "Miss Johnson, I appreciate you coming today. What I am about to discuss is not a financial audit or consulting project." Maya listened carefully, her expression steady but curious. Alexander stepped closer to the table and placed a thin folder in front of her. "It is a proposal," he continued, "but not the kind usually presented in a boardroom." Maya opened the folder slowly, her eyes scanning the first page before lifting again in quiet disbelief. The document did not describe a financial agreement between companies. It described something far more unexpected: a one-year marriage contract between two people who had never met before. The silence in the office stretched for several seconds after Maya Johnson finished reading the first page of the document. Outside, the towering windows Central Park lay beneath a thin layer of winter sunlight, but inside the room the air felt strangely still. Maya slowly closed the folder and lifted her eyes toward Alexander Hayes. Her expression was calm, yet there was unmistakable disbelief in her voice when she spoke. "You are asking me to marry you." Alexander did not react to the surprise in her tone. He had expected it. Instead, he walked toward the window and rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair before answering. "I am asking you to enter into a one-year contractual marriage. It would be a legal arrangement with clearly defined boundaries." Maya studied him carefully. She had met many executives during financial consultations, but none had ever presented an agreement like this. "And why?" she asked quietly. "Would the chief executive officer of one of the largest companies in the country need a contractual marriage with someone he has never met?" Alexander did not hesitate. "Because my father believed leadership should be tied to family stability. His trust requires the chief executive officer of Hayes Global to be married. Without it, the board has the legal authority to replace me within 6 weeks." Maya absorbed the explanation silently. The situation sounded less like romance and more like corporate strategy. "And you believe I would agree to something like this?" she asked. Alexander stepped back to the table and opened the folder again, turning to a page near the middle. "You were selected because your professional background demonstrates integrity and discretion. You are not connected to media networks, political donors, or corporate competitors. In addition, your financial work with nonprofit hospitals shows consistent ethical decision-making." Maya raised an eyebrow slightly. "You investigated my life." "Only publicly available records," Alexander replied calmly. "And the agreement is entirely voluntary. If you decline, the meeting ends and your privacy will remain protected." Maya looked down at the document again. The numbers written in the compensation section were enough to change the direction of a person's life. Yet money had never been the reason she made decisions. "Why would anyone accept a marriage that exists only on paper?" she asked quietly. Alexander watched her carefully before answering. "Because it would solve a problem." Maya met his gaze without hesitation. "Whose problem?" For the first time, Alexander allowed a faint, almost amused expression to cross his face. "Both of ours." Maya remained silent, waiting for the explanation. Alexander continued in the same steady tone he used during board negotiations. "Your financial records show outstanding medical debt associated with your brother's recent surgery. According to the hospital foundation report you prepared, the remaining balance exceeds $160,000. Maya felt a quiet tension settle in her chest. She had worked hard to keep those struggles private. "You went deeper than public records," she said softly. Alexander did not deny it. "The contract would eliminate that debt immediately," he replied, "in addition to the compensation listed in the agreement." Maya looked again at the numbers printed across the page. They were more than enough to pay every bill waiting on the kitchen counter of her apartment. Yet something about the proposal still felt unreal. She closed the folder once more and rested her hands calmly on the table. "And after 1 year?" she asked. "The contract ends," Alexander said. "Our lives return to normal." Maya studied his face for several seconds, searching for any sign of hesitation or hidden intention. Instead, she found only the composed certainty of a man used to solving problems with logic. Finally, she leaned back slightly in the chair and spoke in a quiet voice that carried both curiosity and caution. Mr. Hayes, people do not usually marry strangers to solve financial equations. Alexander met her gaze without blinking. That may be true, he said, but extraordinary situations rarely follow ordinary rules. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The quiet office high above Manhattan felt suspended between two very different worlds, one built on billion-dollar strategies and the other shaped by quiet responsibility and sacrifice. Maya Johnson rested her hands lightly on the closed folder while she looked out toward Central Park through the enormous windows. The trees below were bare from winter, their branches stretching across the frozen ground like delicate lines drawn across a painting. It was a peaceful view, yet the decision placed before her felt anything but simple. Finally, she turned back toward Alexander Hayes. You speak about this as if it were a business partnership, she said calmly. Marriage is supposed to be something different. Alexander nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer from the beginning. In many ways it is a partnership, he replied. People build families, homes, and futures through agreements. This arrangement would simply remove the emotional uncertainty. Maya allowed a faint smile to appear for the first time since the meeting began. You make it sound very efficient. Efficiency is often underestimated, Alexander answered quietly. Maya opened the folder again, slowly turning through the pages that outlined the structure of the agreement. The terms were carefully written. 1 year of legal marriage. Public appearances together when necessary. Separate personal finances. Complete respect for privacy and personal boundaries. At the end of 12 months, both parties would quietly separate without conflict or publicity. The language was clear, almost clinical, yet the idea itself remained deeply unusual. Maya closed the document once more and leaned back in the chair. And what happens during this year? She asked. Do we simply pretend? Alexander stepped closer to the table, his expression thoughtful but composed. We maintain the appearance of a normal marriage in public settings. Beyond that, your personal independence remains completely intact. There are no expectations beyond professionalism and mutual respect. Maya studied him carefully again. There was no arrogance in his tone, only a calm confidence shaped by years of leadership. Yet something about the proposal still felt unreal, like a scene from someone else's life. You understand that agreeing to something like this would change everything about my daily life, she said. My job, my privacy, even the way strangers look at me. Alexander acknowledged the truth in her words with a small nod. Yes, it would. The room fell quiet again as Maya considered the reality of what he was offering. In her mind, she saw the stack of hospital bills waiting at home. She thought about her younger brother finally beginning to recover after months of treatments and uncertainty. She thought about the nights spent calculating expenses and wondering how long it would take to clear the remaining debt. 1 year. The words repeated quietly in her thoughts. Just 1 year of a carefully defined arrangement. Finally, she looked directly at Alexander again. And after 12 months, she asked slowly, Our lives separate completely? Yes, he answered. No complications. No obligations. Maya rested her fingers gently against the edge of the table while she studied the man sitting across from her. Alexander Hayes had built an empire by making decisions quickly and with confidence. Yet in this moment he waited patiently, allowing her the time to decide for herself. Outside the windows, the afternoon sunlight began to soften as the winter day moved quietly toward evening. Maya took a slow breath, then closed the folder one final time. I will need to think about this, she said calmly. Alexander nodded once. Of course. As she stood to leave the office, neither of them could yet see how the simple decision waiting ahead would slowly begin to transform the careful boundaries both of them believed would never change. That evening, the quiet streets of Brooklyn glowed beneath rows of yellow streetlights, while Maya Johnson walked slowly toward her apartment building with the winter air brushing gently against her face. The city sounded different here than it did in Manhattan. Instead of polished office towers and constant traffic, there were small grocery stores closing their doors for the night, distant music from a nearby restaurant, and the occasional rumble of the subway beneath the pavement. Maya climbed the narrow stairs to the second-floor apartment she shared with her younger brother and paused outside the door for a moment before stepping inside. The familiar scent of homemade soup greeted her immediately. Her brother Daniel was sitting at the small kitchen table with a blanket over his shoulders and a medical booklet open in front of him. The surgery had been successful, but recovery would take time and patience. When he looked up and saw her expression, he smiled warmly. "Long day?" he asked. Maya placed her coat on the chair and returned the smile gently. "You could say that." She poured herself a glass of water and sat across from him while the quiet apartment hummed with the low sound of the refrigerator and the distant city beyond the window. For a few minutes they talked about ordinary things. Daniel's next hospital checkup, a neighbor who had brought groceries earlier in the afternoon, the snow forecast expected later in the week. Yet the folder resting inside Maya's bag felt heavier with every passing minute. Eventually Daniel noticed the thoughtful look in her eyes. "Something happened at work today," he said softly. Maya hesitated for a moment before reaching into her bag and placing the thin document folder on the table. "Not exactly work," she replied. Daniel opened the folder and scanned the first page. His eyebrows slowly lifted in disbelief. "Wait," he said quietly. "This is a marriage contract." Maya nodded once. Daniel read another line and leaned back in the chair with a mixture of amazement and confusion. "The Alexander Hayes?" he asked. "The technology billionaire?" Maya gave a small sigh. "Yes." Daniel stared at the document again as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more ordinary. "Why you?" he asked after a moment. Maya explained the meeting calmly, describing the legal condition tied to Hayes Global and the practical arrangement Alexander had offered. When she finished, the room fell silent again. Daniel looked down at the numbers listed in the agreement and then back at his sister. "This would pay everything," he said carefully. "The hospital bills, the loan from the pharmacy, everything." Maya nodded quietly. She already knew that truth. The amount written on that page represented freedom from months of quiet worry. Yet something inside her still felt uncertain. "But it is still a marriage," she said softly. Daniel closed the folder slowly. "For 1 year," he replied. Maya stood and walked toward the small window, overlooking the street where snow had begun drifting softly through the glow of the streetlights. The world outside looked calm and almost magical, as if the city itself were holding its breath. After a long moment she spoke again, more to herself than to anyone else. "1 year of pretending," she said quietly. Daniel watched her from the table, understanding that the decision before her was not simply about money or contracts. It was about stepping into a life she had never imagined. Maya finally turned back toward him with a thoughtful expression that carried both caution and determination. Somewhere across the river the lights of Manhattan shimmered like distant stars, and in one of those towers Alexander Hayes was still working late into the night, unaware that the answer to his unusual proposal was slowly forming in a quiet apartment only a few miles away. The following morning arrived quietly beneath a sky filled with slow drifting snow, the white flakes moving gently between the tall buildings of Manhattan, as if the city itself had softened overnight. Inside the Hayes Global headquarters, the executive floor was already awake with the quiet rhythm of early meetings and the soft glow of digital screens. Alexander Hayes stood alone in his office near the tall windows overlooking Central Park, his hands resting loosely behind his back while he studied the winter landscape below. Snow covered the wide paths and the frozen lake like a thin blanket of silver, and for once the usually restless city seemed calm. Yet Alexander's thoughts were not on the scenery. They were on the woman who had left his office the previous afternoon with a decision that could determine the future of his company. He had spent years negotiating with governments, investors, and international partners, but waiting for a single answer had never felt quite like this. On the polished desk, behind him a folder containing the marriage contract remained unopened since Maya Johnson walked out of the office. Alexander believed in preparation and control, yet this situation depended entirely on someone else's choice. At that exact moment, several miles away in Brooklyn, Maya Johnson stood near the window of her small apartment while the snow continued to fall gently outside. The neighborhood streets looked peaceful beneath the early morning light, and the quiet gave her space to think clearly about the decision she had been carrying. In her mind since the meeting, Daniel was still asleep in the next room, recovering strength after weeks of treatment, and the stack of hospital bills remained neatly arranged on the kitchen counter. Maya picked up the thin folder again and slowly opened it. reading the terms for what felt like the 10th time. 1 year. 12 months of public appearances beside one of the most powerful men in the country. 12 months of living inside a world she had never imagined entering. After that, everything would end quietly. The contract promised independence, respect, and financial security, yet the idea of marrying someone she barely knew still felt almost unreal. Maya closed the folder and looked out at the falling snow again. For years she had carried responsibility without complaint, balancing work, family, and endless financial calculations that never seemed to end. This agreement offered something rare, relief. Not only for herself, but for Daniel as well. Finally, she took a slow breath and reached for her phone. Across the river, Alexander's assistant entered the office quietly just as his phone vibrated against the desk. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, "you have a call." Alexander turned from the window and picked up the phone, recognizing the number immediately. For a brief moment, he allowed the faintest trace of curiosity to cross his normally controlled expression before answering. Alexander Hayes speaking. On the other end of the line, Maya Johnson stood beside the window in her Brooklyn apartment while snow continued drifting past the glass. Her voice was calm, steady, and thoughtful when she spoke. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, "I have made my decision." For a moment the world seemed to pause between two separate places in the same city. One man standing high above Manhattan. One woman standing in a quiet apartment across the river. And the simple answer about to connect their lives in a way neither of them could yet fully understand. Snow continued falling across Manhattan as Alexander Hayes stood beside the wide glass window of his office. The phone pressed lightly against his ear while the quiet voice on the other end of the line finished speaking. For a moment he did not respond. The city stretched beneath him in a blur of white rooftops and slow-moving traffic. But his attention remained entirely focused on the single sentence Maya Johnson had just delivered. "I will accept the agreement," she said calmly. Her words carried no excitement, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty shaped by careful thought. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the meaning behind the decision. "Thank you for informing me," he replied in the same composed tone he used during corporate negotiations, yet something about this conversation felt very different from the business deals he handled every day. Maya remained by the window of her apartment while snow drifted softly across the Brooklyn street outside. "I want one thing to be clear," she continued gently. "This arrangement must remain respectful and honest. I will not pretend to be something I am not." Alexander nodded slightly, even though she could not see him. "That condition already exists within the contract," he said. "Mutual respect is the only requirement." The call ended soon after, leaving both of them standing quietly in two separate parts of the same city. For Alexander, the next hours moved quickly. Lawyers were contacted, legal documents finalized, and a private civil ceremony scheduled with careful discretion. The announcement to the Hayes Global Board was prepared with the same precision used for major corporate decisions. Yet despite the controlled efficiency surrounding the process, Alexander found himself thinking about the woman whose calm voice had changed everything with a single sentence. 2 days later, the winter sky cleared above Manhattan, leaving the city bright and cold beneath a pale blue horizon. Inside a small courthouse near Central Park, a simple ceremony was arranged in a quiet room where sunlight streamed through tall windows onto polished wooden floors. There were no photographers, no reporters, and no crowd of curious observers. Only a judge, 2 legal witnesses, and the 2 people whose lives were about to become unexpectedly connected. Maya Johnson stood near the window wearing a simple cream-colored dress and a dark coat folded neatly over her arm. She had never imagined her wedding day would look like this. There were no flowers, no music, and no family members filling the seats. Yet the calm stillness of the room made the moment feel strangely sincere. Across from her, Alexander Hayes stood in a dark suit that reflected the quiet elegance of the ceremony. He had attended countless high society weddings over the years, events filled with luxury and attention, yet none of them felt as meaningful as this quiet exchange of vows. When the judge began speaking, the words were simple and direct, describing the legal bond that would unite them for the next year. Maya listened carefully, her expression thoughtful but steady. Alexander stood beside her with the composed confidence that had built an empire, yet something unfamiliar stirred beneath that calm surface. When the time came for the final signatures, they both stepped forward to sign the document resting on the wooden table. Ink touched paper. Two names written beside each other. A contract that began as a business solution had now become a legal marriage. As they stepped outside the courthouse, the winter sunlight reflected brightly across the snowy streets of Manhattan. For the world beyond that quiet building, nothing unusual had happened. Cars continued moving through traffic. People hurried along the sidewalks, carrying coffee and briefcases. Yet for Alexander Hayes and Maya Johnson, the city suddenly looked different. The agreement they believed would remain purely practical had already begun to shift the direction of both their lives in ways neither of them fully understood.